there's some interesting stuff in your kind of start of your career that I think is kind of fun. Like you worked with Jim Cramer, is that right? When you were 16 years old, you worked for Cramer, the guy who's always yelling on CNBC. What was that like? What's Cramer like?
Kramer's great. Hedge funds were a different world back then. It was a very, very small asset class, maybe 50 billion, 100 billion total. Any private partnership is technically kind of a hedge fund, right? If you have outside investors and you're charging them 1 and 20 or 2 and 20, and you're shorting stocks and doing exotic stuff, that's a hedge fund, whether you call it that or not. So Warren Buffett had a hedge fund. Other folks had a hedge fund, but at the time, the biggest hedge funds were Galleon Group, SAC Capital, a handful kind of like Tiger, Soros. It was sort of the wild time for the hedge fund industry, kind of, very, very small industry, maybe 30 or 40 or 50 firms of in any significance. And that means like, $100 million or more. And so Cramer was one of those firms. I got to work there. I was very lucky.
You were in high school at the time?
I was sort of in this like weird state of both being a high school dropout, a high school graduate, and a high school, continuing, kind of education. It was very weird. I went to this very special school called Hunter, where I fulfilled all my degree requirements pretty early. So I was ready, sort of graduated in the state's eyes, but I continued to sort of like go to the school and pick up credits and like go to college at the same time. So it was just a weird like mishmash of education. If you get off to like a good start for your first like 3 or 6 months, often you can get this momentum of raising more capital, and you get this like virtuous cycle. But you can also go in the other direction where, if you, many funds are started by good investors and they end up failing, and those investors sort of come back and take a few years off and start a fund again. Hedge funds have like the shortest lifespan. If you look at the top hedge funds from the 90s, almost none of them exist today. And I think of those like top 10 hedge funds of all time, like 5 were shut down by regulatory intervention. So like, it's a very hazardous job. There's a, 10% chance of like, going to jail being a hedge fund manager. It's a really, kind of dangerous job to be in. And, you're dealing with the markets and you're dealing with representations to investors. Just how to mark privates, right, is kind of like one of these like real debates. I know a guy who went to jail for that fairly recently. Anybody looking into your books can basically say, oh, well, you marked this too high. Therefore you're defrauding your investors for charging them too much. Well, you marked it too low. Well, now you're defrauding them because, you're preferencing the other investors who are coming into the fund. So you really can't win. It's a very tough business. You don't build any actual lasting value. As you know, almost no hedge funds have gone public. So it's just kind of a crummy business in general. And like, I don't recommend anyone kind of get into it unless they're so interested in stocks that they can't, help but like spend their whole time looking at stocks. Like Cramer back then, Cramer's like a stock addict, right? So this guy, again, I consider him, not quite a friend, but like I have a fond memory of working with him. I mean, he is like a drug addict to their drug. He is like that to securities. Like he cannot get away from it. There's nothing he loves more in the world than stocks. And you think about people like Warren Buffett and say, maybe that's kind of like them. And the average person who wants to get into hedge funds, they want to get into it because, I can make $10 million or I can make $50 million in a year. Wow, look at that. Jim Simons made $1 billion. I can be like that. That sounds great. And, that's a terrible, terrible, terrible way to look at it, right? If you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about S&P earnings estimates, you should be in hedge funds, right? But if you don't care on a Sunday, what the news is going to be on Monday in the stock market, or what, your favorite company CEO is doing that night, it's not for you. And I think there are people that the hedge fund industry has grown so much. People come to finance not understanding that. In the 90s and the 80s, the only people that were in hedge funds were people like Jim and Buffett and people like that were just like so intensely, insanely possessed by the gyrations of the market. And if that's not you, it's kind of not a good industry.